Today, we are on part 3 of a series called... I can't remember right now, and then I need the next slide, please. Nope, it's not there. Oh, we didn't get it at all. That's fine. You can go back. Sorry. So it's Unlikely Heroes. Thank you. See, my brain isn't there because I didn't prepare a message this week because Patrick's going to share the word today. We've been talking through some of the people of less ill repute in the Bible and how God worked through them. People who had these episodes of moral failings and who weren't great folks, and yet somehow God turns that story around, redeems them, and does something powerful through them. And I encourage you to hop on our Facebook page or YouTube. You can see the last couple of weeks I've talked about Moses. I've talked about Joseph from Genesis. Next week, we're going to be talking about the unlikely hero of Mary, who, though we don't have any stories of moral failings from Mary, we do see this teen mom kind of adrift in the world, and we see her step up in faith also as we enter into the season of Advent next week. So how about that? With that, I'd like to invite Patrick to come forward, who is going to be speaking with us about the story of Rahab. Let's welcome Patrick up.
Good morning. Got a nice cushion today. All right, so we're continuing our series on unlikely heroes, and today we're focusing on the Old Testament character Rahab. I want to admit at the outset that giving a sermon on Rahab makes me uncomfortable. I think you might suspect why, because just looking at me, it's hard to see how I am like Rahab in any way. And while it's not impossible to tell the story about someone unlike yourself, it is true that stories are better told by those who speak out of their own experience, especially when the character is someone who is marginalized or oppressed. As a man, and in our social context, a white man, I don't have a claim to being marginalized or oppressed. If I choose, I can live each day in the privilege that those two descriptions of myself provide. And whether I consciously know it or not, I do live that privilege. Of course, this is a problem, and what it means for my ability to tell the story of Rahab is that I will fail. I cannot do Rahab justice. But the problem is bigger than me because the story of Rahab has always been explained by men, or by women explaining it from within the structures of male-dominated discourse. The majority of the traditional perspectives on what her role is and what her appearance in Scripture means are frankly sexist. It's getting better, but look up Rahab on the internet and you'll see what I mean. Like every other time I've shared my thoughts with you, I'm going into this sideways. We've been talking about unlikely heroes. I'm going to question what that means, why we think we need heroes, why we would include Rahab on a list of heroes. Think of this sermon as an exercise in failure, a struggle through the male-dominated worldview that we have all been, for better or worse, raised in. It's the narrative that has dominated the story of Rahab. In researching for this sermon, I saw the story of Rahab told in mostly the same way. It was basically the story of Rahab that I had been told as a child and then growing up in church. Rahab, an innkeeper in Sunday school, and later a prostitute or a harlot in sermons in big church. She lived in Jericho, a city that God was going to destroy because of its wickedness, and because it was a city that belonged to God's people's enemy, the Canaanites. It also stood in the way of God's people claiming their promised land. Joshua, the leader of God's people, sent spies into the city and then ended up staying in Rahab's inn on the outskirts of the city. I mean, come on. Why were they there? And they were gathering information about Jericho. The king of the city finds out that they are there. Rahab hides the spies and lies to the king, saying that they have left, and she lets them down the walls of the city to return to Joshua. Then the whole Jericho thing happens, the walls crumble, and God destroys the city. But because Rahab believed, and because the spies tied a crimson cord to her window, she and her family were saved. Only she and her family were saved. Later on, she had a son named Boaz, and she was listed in the genealogies of the Gospels, one of the few women to be found there. And so, according to the simplest understanding of what it means to be a hero, Rahab certainly fits the bill. Hooray for God's woman hero, Rahab. Be like her, except for the whole prostitute thing. This version of the story is told and retold, and for most readers of the story, that's as complex as it gets. But I'm sure you guessed by now, I think that there's more to it than that. Maybe you've already started to see the cracks. Maybe you're already starting to see the story fall apart like Jericho itself. The Sunday school version is the perfect version of this story for a male-dominated audience. It simplifies Rahab to the point where she's nothing more than a woman looking out for her family, doing whatever it takes to survive. And it's safe, because she is a hero despite. Always despite. Despite being a woman. Despite being a lowly innkeeper. Despite being a prostitute. Despite living on the outermost part of the city where the poor and oppressed live. Despite the fact there are actions that she acted as a traitor that led to the annihilation of her people. Despite is such an illusory state. It's deeply connected to the basic notion of a hero. Now, I'm a big baseball fan, so when I start to think of heroics, that's usually where my mind goes. One of my favorite moments in all of baseball history, and you can really only relate here if you're a fan of the Boston Red Sox or a total baseball geek. One of my favorite moments happened in 2004 when my Red Sox were facing the evil Yankees in the last playoff series before the World Series. In a best-of-7 series, the Yankees were up 3-0. In the whole history of professional sports in this country, no team had ever lost the first 3 games and won the series. In the bottom of the 9th inning, against a pitcher who would become the first to be unanimously voted into the Hall of Fame, the Red Sox came up to bat down by a run. They start off with a hit and replace the hitter with a pinch runner, Dave Roberts, a guy who's on the team for his speed. Everyone knows what's going to happen next. They don't know what the result will be, but they know he's going to be running. Sure enough, on the very next pitch, Roberts takes off and slides into second base, narrowly avoiding a tag. He steals the base, and 1 pitch later runs home to score the tying run on another Red Sox base hit. The Sox end up winning the series on an unbelievable comeback and go on to win the World Series for the first time in over 80 years. Dave Roberts in that moment was a hero. Despite having a simple role, despite everyone knowing what he's about to do, despite the fact that inevitably it won't matter because the Yankees are going to win, right, Twins fans? But he steals the base and immortalizes himself in Red Sox history. See, you really don't care as much as I do. But there are 3 things I want you to notice, and they all have to do with why and how Dave Roberts is called a hero and what that means about our definition of a hero. First of all, he wasn't the star of the team, but he wasn't like the worst player either. He knew his role, and he fulfilled it. He had a job to do, and he did it. Second, it was a consequence of the circumstances, which were completely out of his control, that created the space for his simply doing his job to become a heroic act, not anything he did himself. And third, despite those points, we call him a hero nonetheless. The despites for Dave Roberts are so very different from the despites for Rahab. But I want to argue that what happens is that we conflate the 2 kinds of despite in a way that covers us from having to come to terms with why those despites exist in the first place. And those despites, in the case of Rahab, are deeply sexist, classist, and moralistic. That's a glaring problem because Rahab's story needs to be told. She needs to be freed from the constraints that chain her to the expectations of sex, class, and morality. Those expectations set Rahab apart, make her unequal to all those who are the better sex, the better class, and more moral. They don't treat her as fully human. The way her story has been told has made Rahab into an excuse not to change the way that we treat sex, class, and moralism, because despite her lowly position, she broke through. We treat her like a hero because she pulled herself up by the bootstraps and made her own history, and that's just a big fat lie. Here's the point where I get into water that I can't swim in. I should not be in front of you talking about Rahab, except that any critique that we have against injustice should include ourselves. Because I am not a woman, I cannot speak from that perspective. As a person who does not live on the outskirts of the city, I cannot speak from that perspective. And yet here I am. The story we've told about Rahab keeps on being told by people who cannot speak from that perspective. The church has often failed to do justice to Rahab and her story because we have not allowed the voices of other Rahabs be the voices that tell her story. We have been complicit in the sexism, classism, and moralism that never fully accepted Rahab as she was, but as how she fit the dominant narrative. Which is ironic because one of the really important aspects of the Rahab narrative in Scripture is that she gets fully included in the community of Israel and plays an important genealogical role that leads all the way to Jesus. I'm not going to be able to tell you the true story. I can't, and I won't try. But I can tell the story of my own complicity in the telling of false stories, and I can invite you to join me in the work, in doing the work to change the world. It starts, first of all, with us, Roots and Branches, doing everything we can to be intentional in giving space to the voices of the women in our church, and hearing those stories with ears to hear. I've been blessed to be part of the Intentions group of leadership here at Roots and Branches. It's a group made up mostly of women, and it's awesome. The women of this church are such an important part of the everyday practical elements and of the spiritual elements of what keeps us running. I don't know if we do enough to acknowledge that. Because, of course, it's not despite their being women or even because of it, but because we are all needed in this striving together to be God's people. So we can always do better. We're not the worst, but we can do better. Secondly, we can continue to look at the ways that we fail to hear the story of Rahab in ways that break through our assumptions. We have to understand that we don't automatically get it, and that often we think we do because we fail to see how our positions of privilege misinform us. And I'll say that again with a modification. I have to understand that I don't automatically get it, and I often think that I do, because I fail to see how my position of privilege informs me. Finally, we need a dangerous version of Rahab's story, a version that takes seriously her womanhood, that takes seriously her position in her society, that takes seriously her role as a sex worker, that takes seriously her role in colonization, that takes seriously her role in abetting an ethnic cleansing, that takes seriously our assumptions about heroics, about faith, and about humanness. That's a story that I cannot tell. It might not be a story that any of us can fully tell, but it's a story worth being told, because otherwise all we have are the mistakes that I keep making by being the one sitting here talking about it. And it's a story worth being told precisely because the reason the traditional telling of the Rahab story is problematic is because the Bible doesn't always do the best job of representing women. And it definitely doesn't make a plain point about equality of the sexes. There's work to do as we try to read it differently than we have before, instead of looking just at how Rahab isn't or isn't heroic, also looking at why we would ever have doubted her in the first place. I want to end my time with you here today by once again admitting that I'm deep in the struggle, and that I can only hope that I didn't fail horribly today to take a proper account of who I am and what that means about my own connection to Rahab's story, which again is a failure because it's all about me again. I guess it just shows that we really do have a lot of work to do to ensure that everyone is included. And if nothing else, what I've shared today can be a broken-hearted love letter where I admit my faults and sit with my failures and ask you all, but especially the women of Roots and Branches, especially my 2 daughters and my wife, to take my hand and lead me. Lead me with your stories. Lead me with your perspective on Rahab. Lead me away from undue privilege until we get to the point where there is no more leading. It's just us holding hands and walking together as we act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God.